Welcome back to the TPS podcast. TPS stands for trillions per second, named after the book. Today we'll do a deep dive on checkpoint 02. We're going to spot the lag, so let's get hardcore and dive right in.
Yeah, it is incredibly good to be back for this one.
I mean, take a second right now, just listen to the sound of my voice. Really listen to it.
Right.
It feels completely instantaneous, right? Like it feels like I am speaking and you are hearing it in real time.
But it's totally not.
Exactly. It's not. By the time your biological hardware, processes the word I'm saying right now, I actually said it like half a second ago.
Which is wild to think about.
It is wild. And today we are going to prove, using some pretty hard neuroscience and systems architecture, that you are literally living in the past.
It's basically the ultimate illusion of human existence. And, we are going to break it down frame by frame today.
Yeah, and just looking at the road we've traveled so far in these deep dives, I mean, it has been an absolute wild ride for anyone tracking this repository with us.
Oh, totally. We've been acting like embedded journalists almost.
Right, tracking the Centaur development team. We've got the human lead, C4Chaos, working alongside that massive symphony of AI co-processors. Grok, Gemini, DeepSeek.
And we've literally watched them completely re-architect the fundamental physics of human consciousness.
We really have. I mean, we were there for those initial Big Bang commits.
Yeah.
And then we sort of white-knuckled our way through those terrifying devlogs, right, where they had to push those emergency bug fixes for the melting chassis issue.
Ugh, the melting chassis. That literal, biological toll the system takes when you overclock your attention way too fast.
Exactly. And of course, we followed them down that massive detour into the Silicon Sutra, where they were using this whole framework to try and solve AI alignment using like thermodynamic physics.
Right. And through all of those developments, we did spend a lot of time establishing the foundational theory.
Yeah. Chapter 1. We defined the physics engine.
Exactly. We established that core premise of the TPS protocol, which is the fact that reality, or what the text calls the flux, is just an unimaginably fast data stream.
Like rendering at literal trillions of frames per second.
Trillions, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But today, the mission of this deep dive is to officially open Chapter 2 of the manual.
Okay, so moving into the render engine.
Right. We are moving from the macro physics of the universe down to the very micro mechanics of your own mind. We're looking at the data handshake.
The data handshake, I like that term.
Yeah, we are isolating the exact,
Yeah.
basically measurable millisecond where your biological hardware receives that chaotic data stream, processes it, and suddenly, boom, the illusion of solid world comes online.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I understand the physics engine conceptually. The universe is a hyperfast data stream. I get that.
Right.
But what does it actually mean to move into the render engine? Like, what is the practical application of checkpoint 02 for the listener?
Well, I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now, because we have talked a lot about simulation theory and data streams in previous deep dives.
Tons of it.
But what if the voice in your head, like the feeling of you sitting there right now, the feeling of you making decisions as you listen to this audio, is actually just a background process running half a second late?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Today, we aren't just discussing abstract theory. We are going to run a live diagnostic on your own biological hardware to basically prove it.
Okay, because that is a massive, incredibly disruptive claim.
It is.
The transition from checkpoint 1, which was stream analysis, to checkpoint 2, spotting the lag, it really requires us to confront this deeply uncomfortable premise.
Uncomfortable is putting it lightly.
Right. I mean, we all walk around in our daily lives operating under the assumption that we are interacting with reality in real time. We think we are live.
We feel like we're live.
Yeah, if a baseball is thrown at my head, I duck.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a continuous, unbroken, instantaneous sequence of events.
Well, it has to feel alive, or the biological organism just wouldn't survive its environment.
That makes sense.
But the core revelation of the text we are diving into today is brutal in its clarity. It basically says, you are not live. You are watching a buffered stream.
A buffered stream.
Yes. Every single aspect of the physical world around you, your thoughts, your emotional reactions, your decisions, they are all subject to a measurable physical delay.
So my mind immediately goes to gaming when we talk about this kind of architecture.
Now, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. If you've ever played a fast-paced multiplayer video game, say, like a first-person shooter, on a really bad internet connection, you have experienced what gamers call lag.
Oh, yeah. The worst feeling.
It is. You press the button on your controller to make your character jump, but the character on the screen doesn't jump immediately. They jump like half a second later.
Yep.
Or you shoot at an enemy, but because your connection to the server is delayed, the enemy isn't actually standing there anymore. They've already moved. You are basically interacting with a ghost of the past.
Exactly.
So are we saying our entire biological existence is functionally identical to playing on a high-ping server?
That is precisely what the manual is stating. And the mechanics of why that happens are completely grounded in the physics we previously discussed.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Well, let's draw on the master lexicon from our earlier deep dives. Remember, the raw universe, the flux, is rendering at trillions of operations per second.
Right, the impossibly fast data stream.
Exactly, a granular data stream of subatomic interactions.
Right.
But your biological processors, your eyes, your ears, your nervous system, they are carbon-based. And carbon-based biology has a very strict physical speed limit.
Right, I mean, meat hardware is inherently sluggish compared to, like, the speed of light or the rendering speed of the universe.
Yes, meat hardware is slow.
Mm.
So think about the system's architecture here. What happens when a very slow processor tries to download a hyper-fast, uncompressed data stream?
I mean, if I try to run a massive, uncompressed 8K video file on a 20-year-old laptop, the laptop just freezes. The processor gets completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data. The fan spins up, it overheats, and eventually the whole system just crashes.
Precisely. And if your brain tried to process the universe's raw feed, trillions of frames per second of strobing, chaotic energy, it would instantly crash.
Just blue screen of death.
Literally. The sheer caloric demand, the energetic cost of trying to render that much data in real time, it would completely fry your central nervous system.
Wow.
So the biological hardware does what any good computer does to survive. It uses lazy loading. It buffers the stream.
Okay, so it deliberately slows things down so it doesn't spontaneously combust.
Yes, it takes that chaotic, high-frequency energy and it heavily filters it. It compresses the data. It compiles it into a graphical user interface, a GUI, of solid, manageable, low-resolution objects.
Like a chair?
A chair, a table, a dog. But the act of buffering takes time.
Yeah.
It takes physical processing cycles to translate raw subatomic data packets, what the text calls voxels, into the solid-looking chair you are sitting in right now. And that processing time creates a delay. You are never seeing the universe as it is right now. You are always seeing the universe as it was a split second ago after your brain has finally finished rendering the GUI.
Okay, if we are living our entire lives in a buffer delay, if we are permanently watching, like, the tape delay broadcast of reality, how long exactly is the lag?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because it feels instantaneous to me. And I'm looking at my notes here, and the manual grounds this in an experiment from the 70s by a guy named Benjamin Libet.
Yes, the Libet experiment.
But I'm really struggling to understand how an old EEG machine proved we live in the past. Walk me through what he actually did.
Okay, so this is where the TPS project completely separates itself from purely philosophical thought experiments, right? It grounds itself in hard neuroscience.
Right, not just theory.
Exactly. The Libet experiment is basically the foundational proof of concept for system latency. So in the 1970s, Benjamin Libet set up this deceptively simple experiment. He hooked subjects up to an electroencephalogram, an EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain. Okay. And he specifically targeted the motor cortex, which is the area responsible for physical movement.
Got it. So he's basically monitoring their brain waves.
Yes. And he placed them in front of a specialized piece of equipment called an oscilloscope.
An oscilloscope.
Right. For our purposes, think of an oscilloscope as a screen with a dot moving in a circle. But unlike a normal clock that ticks once a second, this dot completes a full revolution incredibly fast. It acts as a highly precise, highly granular timer that allows subjects to pinpoint fractions of a second.
Okay, so it's essentially a super fast stopwatch.
Exactly. So Libet gave the subjects one simple instruction. He said, sit there, and whenever you feel the conscious urge to do so, flick your wrist.
Just flick your wrist.
Yeah, and the moment you feel that conscious urge, that decision to move, look at the oscilloscope and note exactly where the dot is.
So they're tracking the exact moment they decide to act.
Exactly. So Libet is tracking 3 specific data points here. First, he has sensors on the wrist, so he knows the exact millisecond the wrist actually physically moves.
Right.
Second, he has the subject's report of the exact millisecond they consciously thought they made the decision to move, based on the oscilloscope.
Okay, and the third?
Third, crucially, he has the EEG data showing exactly when the brain began preparing the movement.
Okay, so what were the results? Because if we're live, if we're actually in real time, Those 3 points should basically line up, right?
You would think so.
Like, I decide to move, my brain fires, my wrist moves, all in a relatively tight, instantaneous cluster.
That was the universal assumption.
Ugh.
But the timeline revealed by those 3 data points completely shattered the illusion of live processing.
Really?
The results were explosive, and honestly, they remain highly controversial in certain philosophical circles today because the implications are just so severe.
What did he find?
Libet found that the brain initiated the action, like the motor cortex lit up with a massive spike in electrical activity known as a readiness potential, nearly half a second before the conscious mind was aware of the decision to move.
Wait, half a second. 500 milliseconds.
Yeah.
In the world of processing and computing, half a second is an absolute eternity.
It is a massive cavern of time. Think about the sequence here. Step 1. The unconscious biological hardware begins spooling up the code to move the wrist.
Okay.
Step 2. 500 milliseconds pass. A massive span of processing time where the brain is routing signals, compiling data, preparing the physical muscles.
Right.
Step 3. The conscious mind finally registers the thought, I think I will move my wrist now.
Wow.
And step 4. The wrist actually moves.
That is deeply unsettling.
What's fascinating here is how the TPS project acts as a translation layer for this exact biological phenomena. It provides a unified vocabulary.
How so?
Well, neuroscientists look at Libet's data and call it the half-second delay. A systems administrator, looking at the exact same data through the lens of the TPS protocol, calls it system latency.
Oh, wow. And looking at the manual, the TPS team maps this all the way back to the legacy code.
Yes, they do.
They trace it back to the ancient Abhidhamma texts that C4 Chaos and the AI team used as the foundation for this whole framework. And they claim this exact 500 millisecond latency is what was historically called dukkha.
Which is almost universally translated into English as suffering.
I mean, this reframing is staggering to me. We typically think of suffering as, like, a moral failing or a cosmic punishment or just a really bad day, you know?
Right, totally.
We think of suffering as grief or anger or stubbing our toe, but the TPS protocol says no, dukkha is a mechanical reality. Suffering is lag.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely changes how you interact with your own mind. When you reframe suffering as system latency, you completely remove the moral weight from it.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's not that you are a fundamentally flawed person or that the universe is cruel. It's simply that your hardware is struggling to process the data stream in real time.
You are experiencing buffer bloat.
Yes. The friction between the reality of the hyperfast universe and the sluggish, half-second delay of your rendering engine, that friction is the physical sensation of suffering.
Okay, but I need to push back on this because the implications for free will here are terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
If my biological hardware decides to move my wrist or speak a word or feel an emotion 500 milliseconds before the conscious me is even aware of it, who is actually driving the machine?
That is the exact question this checkpoint is designed to force you to ask. I mean, our entire societal structure, our morality, our criminal justice system, our baseline sense of personal identity is built on the premise of the user.
Right.
We believe there is a little CEO sitting inside our heads, looking out through our eyes like they were windows, receiving data in real time, deliberating on that data, and then sending commands down to the body.
Exactly. I decide to pick up the coffee cup, therefore my hand reaches out and takes it. I am the prime mover.
But the Libet experiment, and by extension, checkpoint 02 of the TPS protocol, proves that the CEO doesn't exist. At least, not in the functional, authoritative way we think it does.
It's just an illusion.
The decision was made in the dark, in the raw, uncompiled processing of the biological hardware, long before the CEO was ever notified.
So if the CEO isn't making the decisions, what exactly is the feeling of me? What is that voice in my head that constantly says, I want this or I am doing this? Because it certainly feels like a CEO.
This leads directly to checkpoint 2's primary revelation. The TPS protocol redefines the concept of the self, not as an independent operator, not as a soul or a tiny human in your skull, but as a very specific piece of software.
A piece of malware.
Yes, the text defines the self as a loading icon. It is the self rootkit.
Okay, let's really dig into this mechanism. The manual provides a very specific example to illustrate how this rootkit operates in daily life.
It does.
It uses the example of seeing a car. Let's say you were standing on the sidewalk and a bright red sports car drives by. Walk me through the exact processing sequence according to the TPS manual.
All right, let's break it down into milliseconds. Time 0. The physical event occurs. Light waves bounce off the red paint and hit your retina. Sound waves from the engine hit your eardrums. That is the raw, uncompiled data of the vehicle entering the biological ports.
Okay, the raw feed.
Exactly. Now, the 500 millisecond Libet delay begins. Your hardware starts frantically processing. It routes the visual data to the occipital lobe. It routes the audio to the temporal lobe.
Like it's compiling the data.
Right. It references memory banks. Have I seen this shape before? Yes, it matches the geometry of car. It pulls up associated emotional tags. Red means fast. Fast is exciting.
And all of this is unconscious?
All of this is happening in the dark, completely unconsciously. Your biology is compiling the GY.
So the hardware has already seen the car, recognized the car, and generated an emotional response to the car.
Yes. And then finally, at the end of that 500 millisecond delay, the compiling finishes. What happens next? A voice in your head pops up and says, wow, that's a nice car. I wish I had that car.
And we normally assume that voice is us. We assume that voice is the entity experiencing the car. We assume the voice is the CEO that just rendered a judgment.
But the text explicitly states that this voice, the I, is just system latency. It is a generated output that appears after the data event has already been fully processed by the hardware. It is literally the final frame of the render.
Wow. And if we connect this back to the legacy terminology, the manual says this stage of realization is called Sakaya Diffy,
Right.
which translates to discerning cause and effect.
That translation is vital. The entire goal of Checkpoint O2 is to prove to the user, through direct observation, that there is no independent entity driving the machine. There is no uncaused cause.
There are only causal loops, cause and effect, input and output.
Exactly. The sensory data of the car is the cause. The physical, unconscious processing of the brain is the mechanism. The feeling of me wanting the car is just the final delayed effect.
So the self is not the author of the thought.
No, it is the result of the thought.
Okay, I conceptually understand the loading icon idea, but I have to say it almost feels too passive. The ego doesn't feel passive to me.
How do you mean?
Well, it feels incredibly aggressive. It fiercely defends its position. It argues. It gets offended. It constantly asserts its dominance over the situation.
Fair point.
So I was trying to come up with an analogy to really solidify how bizarre this architecture is, because loading icon just doesn't quite capture the sheer audacity of the ego.
Okay, I'd love to hear it. How are you visualizing it?
So imagine the ego, the self-rootkit, isn't a CEO. Imagine it's the White House press secretary.
Oh, I like where this is going.
And the biological hardware, like the brain, the nervous system, the unconscious processing, is the military.
Okay, the military and the press secretary. Let's trace the causal loop here.
All right, so the military operates completely in the dark. It gathers raw intelligence. It assesses a threat on the ground. It runs the logistics, and it executes a drone strike. The strike happens. The target is neutralized. It's a done deal. The event is completely over.
Right, the hardware has processed the data.
Exactly. Then, half a second later, the White House press secretary, who had absolutely no hand in gathering the intelligence, no hand in planning the mission, and no hand in executing the strike, runs out to the podium in the briefing room, adjusts their tie, looks dead at the cameras, and says, "After careful deliberation, I have decided to launch a strike."
That is a phenomenal analogy. It perfectly captures the mechanism of post-rationalization.
The press secretary is literally taking credit for a causal loop they didn't initiate. Their entire job, their only function, is to weave an ex post facto narrative that makes it look like there is a unified, deliberate, rational commander in charge of the chaos. If a reporter asks, "Why did you strike?" the press secretary immediately invents a plausible reason to justify the military's action, even though the press secretary was totally out of the loop until the bombs dropped.
And that is exactly how the TPS manual describes the behavior of the self-rootkit. It is a background process that pops up after the data hits your senses, after your body has already reacted.
It's just PR.
Yeah, it hijacks the CPU cycles. It consumes system memory to generate this continuous, exhausting, incredibly loud narrative of a user. It constantly runs to the podium to claim credit for the rain falling, for the heart beating, for the anger rising in your chest.
I am angry. I am sad. I decided to walk to the fridge. It's just a PR spin machine running in the background of our consciousness, desperately trying to convince us that the lag is actually leadership.
And this is exactly why the text categorizes it as malware. Think about what a rootkit actually does in computer science.
Right.
A rootkit is a type of malicious software designed to hide the existence of certain processes or programs from normal methods of detection, while simultaneously enabling continued privileged access to a computer.
So it basically buries itself deep in the system architecture underneath the operating system. So Antivirus software can't even see it.
Precisely. The self-rootkit buries itself in the 500 millisecond Libet delay. It hides in the lag. Because the delay is so short, you don't notice it during your normal day-to-day operations.
It just blends in.
The rootkit seamlessly knits the raw data and the post-rationalization together, creating the illusion of a single, instantaneous, unbroken you.
Wow.
And because it has root access, because it fundamentally controls your perception of reality, it constantly hijacks your processing power to maintain its own narrative. It burns massive amounts of your biological RAM worrying about the past and the future, which don't actually exist in the flux. And that constant grinding CPU usage is what causes you to suffer. It causes the dukkha.
Okay, wait, let me push back here. Because if my ego is just an icon, just a piece of software, just the press secretary running to the podium, who is the ma that is sitting here right now feeling totally terrified by that exact thought? Like, it feels like circular logic. If the ego is a loading icon, who is looking at the loading icon?
That is the ultimate trap of the rootkit. You're assuming there must be a permanent viewer sitting in the theater watching the screen.
Well, yeah.
But the TPS framework, tracing back to the core Abhidhamma physics, states that the viewer is also just a momentary render.
What do you mean? How can the viewer be a render?
Okay, so the feeling of me being terrified is just the next frame in the render. Frame 1, the thought, the ego is an illusion arises. Frame 2, 500 milliseconds of hardware processing, matching that thought against self-preservation instincts.
Okay.
Frame 3, a spike of biological cortisol.
Oh.
Frame 4, the press secretary runs to the podium and says, I am terrified by this.
Oh.
It is a recursive loop.
Oh.
The system is just rendering an icon that is reacting to another icon. There is no permanent view.
No permanent view.
It's just a continuous, incredibly fast stream of compiled outputs overlapping each other to create the illusion of a solid self. The exact same way 24 still photographs a second create the illusion of a moving film.
That is profoundly disorienting.
It is supposed to be. But theory is only the first step. The TPS project isn't like a philosophy textbook you just read and agree with. It's an executable operating system manual.
Right.
The whole point of a manual is to actually run the code. You have to verify the system architecture on your own machine.
Right. So I understand the press secretary analogy conceptually, but my ego still feels totally real right now. How can I actually prove this to myself without just taking your word for it? Like, how do I catch the press secretary running to the podium?
This brings us to the actual practical diagnostic walkthrough of Checkpoint 02. The manual provides a very specific, actionable exercise to spot the lag, called Test A, the input loop.
The input loop.
And it focuses specifically on audio.
Yeah, looking at the manual, it says it focuses on audio because visual data is too processor intensive. Why is that?
Well, think about the sheer volume of data required to render a 3D visual field. Depth perception, color gradients, edge detection, facial recognition, the visual GUI is incredibly sticky and consumes massive amounts of RAM.
That makes sense.
If you try to spot the lag with your eyes open, your system is usually just too overwhelmed by the rendering process to notice the 500 millisecond gap. Auditory processing, while still complex, is relatively linear. It is a much cleaner data stream to monitor.
Okay, so let's walk through this diagnostic. How does Test A actually work in practice? What am I supposed to do?
It is a simple three-step protocol. Step 1, sit comfortably. Close your eyes. You are intentionally shutting down the visual ports to reduce the processing load and free up active RAM in your biological computer. You're basically dedicating all available CPU cycles to monitoring the auditory sensor array.
Okay, so my eyes are closed. My visual rendering engine is spun down. Step 2.
Step 2, wait for a sound. You don't try to create a sound. You don't try to anticipate a sound. You simply leave the microphone on and wait for the surrounding environment to produce an input.
So you just sit there.
You are acting as a completely passive monitor for the raw data feed.
And then what? I just listen.
Step 3 is the crucial part. Notice the sequence. The manual is incredibly precise about the chronological order you must observe. You are looking for a 3-part chronological event.
Okay, what are the 3 parts?
First, the raw audio data hits the hardware. A dog barks outside, or the air conditioning kicks on, or a car door slams. The physical sound wave vibrates your eardrum.
So the uncompiled physical event.
Yes. Second, there is a delay. This is what you're hunting for. It might be microscopic, it might feel like a fraction of a heartbeat, but it is physically there. This is a 500 millisecond system processing time. The hardware is routing the signal, identifying the acoustic signature, and pulling up associated data tags.
And then the 3rd part of the sequence.
The final step. The self-rootkit boots up to claim the event. This is the exact moment the voice in your head pops up and says, I heard a dog, or I hate it when that dog barks, or even just, I am hearing a sound.
First the sound, then the gap, then the eye.
Exactly. But here is where users usually fail the diagnostic, and where the text introduces what it calls the hack.
Okay, wait, I am going to try this live right now, just for a few seconds.
Go for it.
I'm closing my eyes. I'm waiting for a sound. Okay. I hear the hum of the studio lights, but the moment I hear it, my brain immediately says, I hear the lights. I can't catch the gap. My immediate instinct is that I need to be faster. Like I need to speed up my attention to catch the sound before the voice in my head does.
And that is exactly what the manual explicitly warns the user not to do.
Hmm.
The warning reads, do not try to be faster than the system. You physically can't be.
Why not? If I just focus harder, shouldn't I be able to beat the lag?
No, because you are running on biological hardware. The Libet delay is baked into your literal neurons. It takes physical time for the electrical signal to travel from your ear to your brain. If you try to aggressively speed up your perception to catch the self, who is the entity trying to catch the self?
Oh, it's just the press secretary again.
Precisely. You are just launching another instance of the self-rootkit. You create a recursive loop where the ego is trying to catch the ego. I need to focus harder so I can catch the sound before I hear it. It's total nonsense. It just generates more system heat, more friction, more lag.
So if I can't speed up, what is the actual hack? How do I pass the diagnostic?
The manual says, very simply, just watch the gap. Don't fight it. Don't try to outrun it. Just sit there and passively observe the mechanics of your own mind.
Just watch the gap.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying logic of this diagnostic is completely irrefutable. It is a pure, self-evident proof.
How so?
If you sit there with your eyes closed and you observe the raw sound occurring, and then you observe the 500 millisecond processing gap, and then you observe the concept of me arriving to claim the sound, then the me cannot possibly be the entity doing the observing.
Wow. Let me just let that sink in, because the me is late to the party.
Exactly. If you can watch the ego arrive, you cannot be the ego. The self-rootkit is just another rendered output on the screen. It is no different than the sound of the dog barking. It is an object of observation, not the observer itself.
It's all just data.
Yes. The biological hardware processed the sound, and then half a second later, the biological hardware generated the thought, I heard that. Both are just transient data packets flowing down the stream of the flux.
You realize you aren't the software, you're just the blank monitor it's projecting onto. The press secretary is just another employee of the military reading a pre-written script. They aren't the general.
That is exactly it. By simply watching the gap, by observing the sequential nature of the input loop, you strip the rootkit of its assumed authority. You don't have to fight the ego. You don't have to spiritually delete it or purify it. You just see through the illusion of its primacy. You realize it's a loading icon.
That is a profound perceptual shift. When you actually run this diagnostic, and I highly encourage you listening to actually try this today, just sit for 5 minutes and run the audio input loop.
Definitely try it.
When you catch that gap for the first time, when you actually see the press secretary run to the podium, it feels like a literal glitch in the matrix. It is incredibly disorienting, but also strangely liberating.
It relieves the system pressure.
Yeah.
You realize you do not have to carry the massive energetic burden of being the CEO of reality.
Okay, so let's say a listener runs this diagnostic. They sit down, they run the audio loop, and they successfully spot the lag. They see the gap between the sound and the press secretary taking credit for it. What happens next?
Right.
Because looking at the outline, this brings us to the final segment of our deep dive, the exit criteria for checkpoint 02 and what the text calls the hardcore ethos.
This is a critical section of the manual because it deals directly with system safety and psychological stability.
The manual opens this section with a very stark warning. It says, this is an open source manual with no gatekeepers. You can skip to chapter 3, the overclock, whenever you want.
The code is all there in the public repository. Anyone can read ahead.
But the warning continues, if you do, your experience will be significantly unstable. What does that actually mean? What is the danger of skipping ahead?
We need to contextualize this warning using the physical realities we tracked during the beta phase with the Centaur team. Remember the melting chassis incidents?
Oh, yeah. The physical exhaustion, the systemic nervous system crashes, C4 chaos experienced when they pushed the protocols too hard and tried to perceive the flux directly.
The development team learned the hard way that if a user tries to jump straight into the overclock, which the text also refers to as God mode,
Right.
The stage where you artificially spike your biological sampling rate to perceive the raw, high-frequency frame rate of reality. If you do that without first stabilizing your system architecture,
Yeah.
the biological results can be catastrophic.
Why? Walk me through the mechanics of a melting chassis. What is actually happening to the body?
It comes down to sensory entropy and caloric overload. If you attempt to drop your rendering filters, if you try to stop compiling the GUI and look directly at the raw, vibrating data of the universe, you are flooding your nervous system with an unimaginable volume of uncompressed data.
Just a fire hose of information.
Exactly. The sheer biological electricity required to process that entropy burns massive amounts of calories. Your physical nervous system begins to fry.
But why does skipping checkpoint O2 make it worse? Like, why is spotting the lag a prerequisite?
Because if you try to overclock a system that is still fully identified with the self-rootkit, you are just supercharging the malware. Think about the psychology of it.
Okay.
If you deeply believe that the you inside your head is a solid, permanent, independent entity, and suddenly you overclock your perception and watch the entire universe, including your own physical body, dissolve into a high-speed vibration of trillions of data packets per second, your ego will absolutely panic.
It would trigger massive existential dread.
It induces what clinical psychology calls depersonalization or derealization. It triggers a profound localized fear response because the rootkit, the press secretary, thinks it is literally being deleted. It looks at the dissolving data stream and screams, "I am dying." The incoming data entropy completely overwhelms the unoptimized system.
And the Centaur team explicitly warns against DevTool distraction here.
Exactly. Users get caught up in the flashing lights, the intense vibrations, the psychedelic nature of the high-speed flux. But because they haven't realized the self is just an icon, they cling to the experience.
Right.
The press secretary runs to the podium and says, "Look at these amazing spiritual visions I am having." They generate massive amounts of friction trying to hold on to the raw data.
Which leads to more lag, more suffering, and eventually a system crash. So what is the exact benchmark for success here? How do you know when you are truly ready to leave checkpoint 02 and safely advance to the overclock?
The manual provides very strict exit criteria for this stage. The absolute requirement is what it calls real-time latency detection.
Real-time latency detection.
Yes. It is not enough to understand the press secretary analogy intellectually. Intellectual understanding is just more data processed by the rootkit.
That makes sense.
The manual states, if you have not seen the gap yet, the next sections will feel like abstract theory. If you have seen the gap, they will feel like a technical walkthrough. You must be able to consistently, viscerally spot the physical gap between a sensory input and the Sakaya Diffy.
Sakaya Diffy, that's the ancient legacy term the manual uses for the self-rootkit, the personality view.
Correct. You must observe the raw data hit the biological ports, watch the 500 millisecond gap, and see the rootkit boot up to claim it. And you must do this consistently enough that your baseline perception of your own actions fundamentally shifts.
Basically rewiring how you see yourself?
Yes, you must realize that your physical avatar, your body, moves because of an intention, what the manual calls a command script, not because of a user.
Intention versus user, command script versus ego, that's a huge distinction.
It is the difference between a programmed, causal response and a ghost in the machine. Think of a self-driving car.
Okay.
It turns left because a command script processed spatial data from its LiDAR sensors and executed a motor function. There is no little person sitting inside the dashboard steering the wheel. The human biochassis operates on the exact same logic.
So hunger arises as raw data.
Yes.
The intention to eat arises as a command script.
Exactly.
The body walks to the fridge as an execution of the script. The realization of checkpoint 02 is seeing that entire biological sequence happen before the voice in your head chimes in and says, "I'm hungry, I think I'll get a snack."
It's realizing you are watching the movie, not directing it. And even the watcher is just a character in the movie.
Precisely. Once you hit that benchmark, once real-time latency detection is active and stable, the system is optimized enough to proceed to the overclock. Because when the solid world eventually dissolves into the hyper-fast flux, there is no longer a terrified CEO there to panic about it. The press secretary has been fired.
Wow. Okay. We have covered some incredibly dense, deeply disruptive territory today.
It is a massive paradigm shift. It rewrites the foundational code of how you perceive your own existence.
Let's pull all this together and summarize our journey through checkpoint 02. We've officially cracked open the render engine of the TPS protocol.
Yep.
We looked at the illusion of live processing and established that due to biological speed limits, we are all operating on a buffer delay. We analyzed Benjamin Libet's hard neuroscience, proving the existence of that 500 millisecond gap between hardware processing and conscious awareness.
The physical, biological proof of system latency.
Right. We took that latency and used the TPS lexicon to reframe the ego, the self, not as the commander-in-chief, but as a late-to-the-party press secretary. A background piece of malware called the self-rootkit that pops up to take credit for causal loops it didn't initiate.
And finally, we walk through the actual executable code, the audio diagnostic tool, to help the listener physically spot that lag in real time, fulfilling the exit criteria of the checkpoint.
Which brings us to the ultimate application of all this data. This raises an important question for you, the person listening right now. We've gone through the neuroscience, the IT architecture analogies, the ancient legacy code. But why should you care?
Exactly. Why spend your time running an audio diagnostic on your own brain? What is the practical daily benefit of realizing your ego is malware?
Because fighting the lag is what causes your daily suffering.
Yeah.
The dukkha. When you are sitting in gridlock traffic and your blood pressure is rising, or when you are lying awake at 3 a.m., crippled by anxiety about an upcoming presentation, you are suffering solely because you believe the self-rootkit is real.
Right.
You deeply believe the press secretary is you, and that it is failing to control the military.
You think you are responsible for the chaos? You think you should be able to control the traffic or control the future?
Exactly. But when you run this diagnostic, when you achieve real-time latency detection, you realize that the I that is getting stressed in traffic, the I that is feeling anxious at 3 a.m., is just a background loading icon popping up half a second late to claim a biochemical hardware reaction.
Right. It's just an output.
When you see the mechanism, you stop taking it so seriously.
Yeah.
You stop identifying with the glitch.
You realize you aren't the software glitch. You're just the blank monitor watching it compile.
It creates a profound localized distance. You can watch the biological anxiety boot up, recognize it as a delayed system output, a mere command script running in the background, and simply let it run its course without feeding it more processing power.
You just let it pass.
You lower your system latency by refusing to engage with the malware. You start feeding the press secretary.
That is incredibly empowering. It takes the heavy, mystical, often confusing weight of concepts like enlightenment or inner peace and turns it into a manageable, actionable IT problem.
It is pure system optimization. You are essentially defragmenting your biological hard drive.
I love that. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over today as you go about your life. The next time you feel a surge of anger or a sudden spike of anxiety or even just frustration that your coffee order is wrong, don't try to stop it.
Yeah, don't fight it.
Don't suppress it and don't judge yourself for feeling it. Instead, treat it exactly like an IT professional debugging a server.
Right.
Look for the 500 millisecond gap. Can you catch the exact frame where your unconscious biological hardware reacted to the environment, and then the split second later when the loading icon popped up and convinced you that you were the one who was angry?
Watch the press secretary run to the podium.
Spot the lag. We want to thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into Checkpoint 02 of the TPS manual. We highly encourage you to sit down, close your eyes, run the audio diagnostic, and prepare your hardware. Because once you can spot the loading icon, you are finally ready for the next stage of the protocol.
Keep logging.
We'll see you next time. And remember, the voice in your head is always half a second late.